you. And Max Richtman has been doing this for so many years, and it's not always the most fun thing to get on an airplane and fly to another city and do what he does. He never stops. He stops as an advocate. He never stops working. He never stops organizing. He never stops agitating. The best part of him. So thank you, and thank you all for coming out. We didn't even know when. I live in Cleveland. I understand that Cleveland gets a little more snow than Columbus, but I also understand that. I went to bed last night. I have an apartment in Columbus, so I'm here a lot. I have a grandchild here, and we're wake up. I hear that it's going to snow last night, right? I wake up this morning, think there's going to be 6 inches of snow. I turn the radio and they cancel schools, and it's just raining. Right now it's snowing. So, but thank you for coming out today, because I know it's not always easy to come out in weather like this and drive on these streets in this kind of weather. So thank you. But more importantly, thank you for your activism and always standing up for advocating for people. You're not really advocating for yourselves. You're advocating for something bigger than you. And thank you for doing that. And that's why we have Social Security. That's why we have Medicare. That's why we have the Affordable Care Act. That's why we have everything from worker safety to minimum wage to unemployment benefits to safe drinking water to clean air, Jeff, to good labor law, generally good labor law, not good enough labor law, because of your activism. I've described this to some of you before. I wear in my lapel a pen depicting a canary in a bird cage. The mine workers took the canary down in the mines 100 years ago. When they did that, the mine worker had no government that cared enough and no union strong enough to protect him, so he had the canary, and if the canary died, he got out of the mines. And since then, because people's life expectancy was about 45 years in those days, 100 years ago. People lived 3 decades longer because of activism of people like you. It's why we have Medicare. It's why we have an FDA and safe food. It's why we have good drinking water. It's why we have labor law and protections for the disabled and women's rights and civil rights and all of that. And you fought for it in your union halls, and you fought for it in your church basements. You fought for it through civil rights organizations and advocating for kids and all that you did that way. And that's really why we're where we are in this country today in so many ways. Max mentioned entitlements, the term entitlements. And when you listen to politicians in Washington, generally making a pretty decent salary, generally living on getting benefits, getting health care from taxpayers, and they talk about, you'll hear them say, conservative politicians, you'll hear them say, we need to reform entitlements. The public thinks, yeah, that makes sense, we need to reform entitlements. Well, scratch a little deeper. Don't let them get away with just saying we need to reform entitlements. What they're really going to do is they're going to do 2 things. They want to do 2 things. They want to shift Medicare costs onto seniors, from the program onto seniors, and they want to cut Social Security. It's as simple as that. So don't let them get away with these talk shows saying we need to reform entitlements, because it's not really about reforming entitlements. It's cutting these programs they don't like. And in 1965. Congressman Bob Dole voted against Medicare and bragged about fighting against it. Congressman Donald Rumsfeld voted against Medicare. Congressman Gerald Ford voted against Medicare. In the 1930s, a lot of the right-wingers hated Social Security. You know all that. So the same people that didn't like Social Security, didn't like Medicare, are the ones opposing the Affordable Care Act. And when you think about this, and I want to talk a little bit about the Affordable Care Act, just in this context, that when this rollout happened, and the president should have done it better, there's no question. I think why he didn't do it as well as he should have is he underestimated how Republicans were not going to expand Medicaid in most places, and how they were not going to set up the exchanges. He couldn't quite believe that now that this is the law and the Supreme Court said it's the law, he couldn't quite believe they'd continue to attack it. I'm not surprised, because I work with these people, but I think the president just really believed something better about them, and I think that's why the rollout wasn't done as well as it should have been. But that's the way it is, so we've got to fix it. But let me do a little history here about how hard it is to do that. This rollout of Medicare is controversial, and the rollout of Affordable Care Act is controversial. We've had the Republicans attacking it for 3 years. But let me go back, and I have this letter that was given me just a week ago. The grandmother, or the grandfather of the woman that gave me this, who actually works in my office, her grandfather got a letter dated December 24th, 1936, from her employer. And this guy's the vice president of Pennsylvania Gas and Electric. on West Market Street in York, Pennsylvania. And he writes, remember this is 1936, on a dear fellow employee, on August 14th, 1935, Congress passed the Social Security Act. Under provision of this act, the company is required to deduct 1% of your wage beginning January 37, 1.5% beginning January 1940, 2% beginning January 1943, 2.5% beginning January 1946, 3% beginning January 1949. And he wrote this in a way basically to say, we don't want to do this, government's making us do it, you'll probably never see the money again. That's the way that this employer, who clearly from this letter didn't like Social Security, but he had to carry out the law. That's what happened in 1936. They didn't want to implement Social Security, but they did. And look what happened 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 50 years later, how this is a bedrock. So without 1/3 of Ohioans who are benefiting from Social Security, it's essentially their whole income. Almost 2/3 of Ohioans rely on seniors rely on Social Security for more than half their income. So we know what that's meant. Take the clock forward from 1936 to 1965, when Medicare passed. All those, Gerald Ford and Bob Dole and all those people were against it. The John Birch Society fought it. The Doctors Association fought it. The insurance companies fought it. Then, in 1965, President Johnson signed it. Several months later, President Johnson told Vice President Humphrey to get on the phone, and Vice President Humphrey called, imagine this, called the governors and the mayors in southern cities, and they said, if you want Medicare, you're going to integrate your hospitals. And just 2 years earlier, civil rights had passed. 1 year earlier, voting rights had passed. And the federal government was going to the South and saying, you want Medicare? You want money? You want money for Medicare? You're going to integrate your hospitals. Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, the best hospital in the South, had the hospital for white people that was good quality, and they had an inferior wing on that hospital for African Americans. And you know what happened? Because of Medicare, they integrated that hospital. You know what happened? White people and black people both got more or less, not always, but more or less equal health care. And you think that wasn't controversial in the South? To go down there and say, you're going to integrate your hospitals you're going to integrate if you want Medicare money? The point is, every time government unveils something big, Social Security, Medicare, the Affordable Care Act, there's a lot of opposition. There's opposition from the John Birch Society, and now it's the Tea Party. There's opposition from the wealthy. There's opposition from Wall Street. There's opposition from groups that have so much privilege because they don't want others to share in that privilege. And that's why this fight on the Affordable Care Act is so important. I'm confident. I know that the right wing is going to continue to oppose this. I'm confident. Maybe 2 years from, maybe a year from now, maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years from now, people are going to look back and think, what was a big deal? The Affordable Care Act's working. Just like they look back on Medicare, working. Look back on Social Security, it's working. That's the lesson of this. And don't let anybody tell you otherwise, because the most privileged of the society always fight against things when we move things forward for the greatest number of people. So I'll just close.